to freight forwarding. That's our first module today. The focus questions today, so this is what we'll be aiming to get out of this particular lecture, is the functions and role of a freight forwarder, their duties and liabilities, and how the role of the freight forwarder is changing over time and has changed over time. Quite a few readings there. I think I might have got a couple of them a little bit out. That should be number 8 there, so apologies for that. Most of them are quite small, and some of them are providing information similar to another reading, but it's really more about that idea of just making sure you're really quite comfortable about what a freight forwarder does, its functions, its roles and its responsibilities. So the first question that we're going to look at are the functions and the role of the freight forwarder. So to get a sense of what services a freight forwarder might offer. Now, if I asked you the question, what is a freight forwarder? Would anybody have a guess at what a freight forwarder is? I mean, in some ways, by the very nature of its name, freight forwarder does give you a sense of what they do. So it's a person or company involved in processing and or the movement of goods for somebody else. So a freight forwarder is a service provider. And I guess one of the things about service providers is that they are providing that service for somebody else. That somebody else could actually do the job if they were in a position to do so. If they felt that they could do that job, perhaps more economically, they've got the wherewithal in their business, they could do that job. However, the freight forwarder exists because persons involved in perhaps an export consignment or an import consignment don't believe they've got the wherewithal to do it. It might be a relatively small company, they might just want to focus on their own producing of goods. So they reach out to somebody else, a person or company. When we talk person, probably a sole trader, might be somebody in partnership, could be a company, to move those goods and to provide those services for them. Now, that particular, it's quite a simplified definition. The other aspect of the definition is that which crosses international boundaries. So we know when we're talking about importing and exporting, that's moving goods outside of a particular country. It's moving outside of a nation. And we know when we do that, it's going to be more complex than doing something within your own country. And typically a lot of that's got to do with the customs requirements of moving outside that country, the distance, how the goods are then going to move out of your control, so you're losing control. So that's where the freight forwarder with their expertise can come in. Now, providing a little bit more detail on that is this particular definition, and this is the Australian peak body for the Australian Freight Forwarders Association. And they provide a little bit more information there on the types of services that are performed by freight forwarders. So if we have a look at this, we can see that they provide carriage. So what they're saying there is that they provide the transportation means, the means of moving those goods from one point to another. They might provide consolidation. In fact, if you were probably highlighting the key areas that a freight forwarder can offer, say an exporter or an importer, consolidation is going to be pretty well at the top of the list. Does anybody remember what consolidation is? A consolidation service.
Like you have small quantity of
Yeah.
good and you pack all that to the big unit of it. To
Absolutely.
all those up at once.
Yeah, that is it in a nutshell. So you've got a LCL, so less than container load, and you've got somebody who's offering you a cheap, or a more economical rate to move your goods by putting it in with some other goods. So that idea of consolidation is probably right at the top of the list in terms of the services that a freight forwarder offers. So we've got consolidation, and we know carriage is transport. Probably options really, because there could be a range of different options. They offer storage. Any thoughts on what the idea around storage? I guess it's pretty straightforward with storage. So potentially they may have their own warehouse. They may have somebody that they might subcontract out to that might store the goods before they're ready for the shipment, and or bringing them back into the warehouse and imported goods and making them available as required. So that's the storage. They can undertake handling, and I guess that's just really more the physical manifestation of taking hold of the goods and moving them as required. It could also include the handling requirements as perhaps the container or shipment goes onto a ship and or aircraft. Now they won't necessarily do that themselves, but they might outsource that to another party. So they can undertake handling, they can undertake packing. I suppose that's when there's specific packaging requirements needed, they perhaps might have the expertise. I guess the thing about the freight forwarder is that the freight forwarder won't necessarily offer all of them. They might offer some where they've got an area of expertise. So they can do the handling and they can do the distribution. And distribution is probably more about just overseeing the shipment as it moves from consignor to consignee, but also the goods coming in through customs and distributing it out to the various parties. So it's all those things as well as ancillary and advisory services. And we'll try and nail that down a little bit later in connection with all it. So the ancillary and advisory relate to customs, any financial matters, declaring of the goods, procuring insurance, collecting and procuring payment for documents, things like that. Now, that's quite a broad remit in terms of the freight forward. You're probably more likely that in regards to fiscal matters, that's more related to the payment of the carriage and other services along the way, rather than the payment between the buyer and the seller. Typically that's the responsibility of the person, the importer themselves. So it won't probably get into those fiscal matters. And also the procuring of insurance could be something that a freight forwarder might do, but there's no obligation on the behalf of the freight forwarder to actually do that. The main obligation, and they don't actually have to do it, is to inform the shipper that they might want to take out insurance. Okay, so carriage, consolidation, transport, handling, packaging, distribution. Can anybody think of any other things that you could, now in your own time, getting a sense of how the services that freight forwarders offer. One option available to you is to visit a couple of freight forwarders online, have a look at their website, and get a sense of the services that they offer. And that'll give you a good understanding of what they see as the headline options in terms of their services. So we know that their services relate to carriage, consolidation, transport, handling, packaging, distribution. Can you think of anything else that you could highlight as a key aspect of what a freight forwarder might offer? Could they do anything else for you? What else could they do? If I'm an importer or exporter, they're organising my carriage, they're doing the consolidation, they're storing it for me, doing the handling, so they're picking it up, they're making sure it's packed right, and they're looking after distribution. Anything else they could be doing? Yeah, so they could be doing some customs declaration. Let's put that down there as a service. So they could do customs declaration, and the reason that they're often called upon to do that is because that's generally an area of expertise that requires a significant amount of knowledge to understand that. So you outsource it to somebody who's got that level of expertise. Now, bearing in mind the specific customs clearing is the area of a customs broker, and that customs broker needs to be licensed. Now, sometimes a freight forwarder might have a customs broker on staff, or a customs broker will outsource that to a separate entity. So they're looking after customs declaration. Any other things you think that they might be offering? Any other service providers they might be dealing with? It's quite broad. Just on the customs declaration, it forms, I'm going to put down documentation. Covers customs declaration, but it covers all the various aspects of documentation in the movement of goods from the seller to the buyer. So if we look at that, and then we have a look at the services does a freight forwarder offer. So they can undertake parcel post customs clearance. So we've got a tick on that one. So they can do that, and they can do it with any of the service providers that might be providing. So they can do it with parcel post. They can do it through, say, one of the main gateways. This one is the Sydney Gateway of customs clearance. So this is a key area. They also can undertake international freight forwarding. Well, I think that's sort of encapsulated in that. They can offer door-to-door. So not all freight forwarders are going to do that, but you've also got a door-to-door option. And generally the door-to-door option puts you in that area of express movement, which is typically looked after by somebody like a FedEx, a DHL, or UPS. So they can undertake that. They're import and export agents. So essentially that's encapsulating that in many ways. But specifically for import and export, which I think we're pretty happy with. Air and sea customs, once again. Freight facilitators, so they can undertake all the interactions in this regard with the key modes of transport. So we've got the transport options covered. They can deal with wharf carriers, which once again are those modes of transport. They can do personal effects clearances. Now, in the main, we're going to talk about in light of importers and exporters, but personal items can also be moved by freight forwarders, and that's one part of the business that isn't, it's not a business movement, but it's a personal item. They can undertake tariff consultants. So part of that customs declaration and documentation requires an understanding of tariffs. Now we're not going to get into too much detail about what tariffs are, but we'll touch on that. They can oversee eBay purchases and customs clearances. So what they're doing is they're putting up their hand and saying, well, this door to door, and if we have a look at logistics, the greatest area of growth is in this area of e-commerce. So they can do that. And they can also undertake quarantine clearances. So once again, that area of expertise, perhaps not in the remit of a normal importer-exporter, but needs to be have the right documentation to undertake that. So what we can get a sense is the freight forwarder can fulfil all those activities, mindful of the situation, but once again, they're a service provider, and if the importer and exporter have their own export area within their business, they might be undertaking those actions. This was, I visited that website. It's got a couple of little videos that give you a sense of what a freight forwarder, their day-to-day operations are. I don't have to go into too much detail in that regard. I didn't put in my little clicks there at the end, so don't worry too much about this. But this just gives you a sense of how freight forwarding has evolved over time. So we know around about in the early 1900s, freight forwarding really wasn't a thing. It was really something that was undertaken by the relevant shipping line and whoever might be a customs agent, so an expert in that regard. Through the 20s and 30s was quite I suppose, a time where a lot of things were happening. Air transport was evolving. There were a number of conventions coming along the way, but it was also the time of war. So the freight forwarding, I suppose, role hadn't taken effect at that particular period of time. World War II, once again, one of those situations where a lot of transport innovations were actually getting proof of concept. So we saw with the Berlin airlift, we saw how all of a sudden freight movement by air was something that seemed quite possible, and a lot of the other transport modes were evolving. But the big change when it came to freight forwarding is post-World War II, and that's also reflective of post-World War II was the time where, I suppose, globalisation started to make a move. So you've got record trade growth, you've got a number of large organisations such as the World Bank, the WTO through the GATT were evolving, and a lot of government regulations and documentations which were around this idea of trade growth and managing the movement of goods through new government regulations and documentation. Now, to make a sense of that, what the various industries were finding is that that was beyond the wherewithal of the transport operators to actually deal with all these new government regulations and documentations. And in the 1950s, for the first time, somebody put up their hand and said, look, we really need somebody in a role that can take charge of these new government regulations and documentations and put some order into the system. And that's where IATA promoted the use of freight forwarders. So IATA, the International Air Transport Association. So that for the first time they said, we need somebody in that role, that service provider, to handle this. Now, the shipping industry, which is a significant industry, didn't actually endorse the use of freight forwarders in the same way as IATA. But what they did say is that freight forwarders were quite useful for small shipments. That was probably as far as they went. Changes in technology, as we know, which is accompanied by globalisation. So we had new transport forms, we had the jet aircraft, we had containerisation, and different transport methods through the 60s and 70s were providing greater options for the freight forwarder to provide a role in the movement of goods. And probably in the late 60s, 70s, policies of government and airlines and shipwright owners were changing quite significantly. This is mainly a time of deregulation. The deregulation meant that the service providers such as freight forwarders were really starting to take hold. So in the last 25 years, there's been a number of events and activities which has, I suppose, solidified the role of freight forwarders in the movement of goods. And they are things such as international terrorism. So when 9/11 came along in the early 2000s, it was early 2000s, 9/11, it completely changed the landscape of the movement of goods in and out of countries, in particular the United States. The level of regulation and requirement for people moving goods out of the United States and with their partners changed quite considerably. We saw the globalisation of corporations, so all of a sudden we saw markets becoming more homogenous, we saw production moving offshore, and that exacerbated the need for somebody to oversee the movement of goods. All of a sudden we were getting economies of scale in the movement of goods around the globe. We saw a rationalisation of shipping and airline services. We saw the evolution of door-to-door services, the UPS, the FedEx options, and we also saw the proliferation of bilateral and multilateral trade agreements. Now, a lot of those things were coming along because individual countries' growth wasn't enough to maintain the economy. So they looked beyond their own countries. Lots of agreements were made over that period of time. So once again, increasing the movement of trade around the globe. But in doing so, these increasing volumes did require significant customs and quarantine law to maintain and ensure that the goods that were moving in and out of countries were such that they weren't going to impact negatively on those countries. So we saw a strengthening. So all this is alluding to is this expertise that's required, that these imposts that were putting on importers and exporters, and in many ways the freight forwarder was that role, fed into that role of providing those services in light of that particular situation. Now, the impact of these global changes essentially led to the worldwide expansion of express, parcel and courier services, which once again is that sort of role of freight forwarder and other logistics service providers. It saw the emergence of logistics providers and supply chain management. Now, that's really beyond the role and capability of your typical freight forwarder. Your traditional freight forwarder is somebody who's going to look after your transport and some ancillary services. But all of a sudden we saw a significant, I suppose, additional area of expertise, the integration of IT in the movement of goods. So these were changing the global movement of goods, and we saw technology innovations going hand in hand with these changes. So we saw the introduction of barcoding, RFID. We're talking about the Internet of Things now, how goods move through steps, and there's a lot more visibility in the supply chain. So that's essentially the situation that we find ourselves in now. And that's, I suppose, in part providing a rationale for how the freight forwarder has moved over time in terms of the services that it's offering. So it's offering all those services and perhaps more. Now, this slide is really just to give you just a bit of a snapshot in terms of what the landscape for freight forwarding looks like in Australia. So this is 2018 freight forwarding and customs broking snapshot. It's done by an organisation, but it's done in conjunction with the Australian Federation of International Forwarders. So the idea here is to gather information about what's happening in the Australian industry, to provide that information back to the industry so they can benchmark where they are in the industry, and also make some informed observations about where the Australian freight forwarding industry is at. So if we have a look at this is some of the information that's provided. The first one is what modes of international freight transport does your business offer? So it's asking freight forwarders that question. So as you can see here, freight forwarders primarily are offering ship and air services. That's the primary focus of their task in terms of modes. You'll also note there's express. Now, not all freight forwarders are going to offer that door-to-door service, and that's probably reflective that 25% of them will offer that particular service. In terms of where freight forwarding activity is occurring, it's probably unsurprising to find that almost 54% and 43% of freight forwarders are operating out of the two main areas of New South Wales and Victoria. So most of the freight forwarding operators will have an office in those particular areas. So that's where the main gateways are in Australia for goods. In terms of the continents that they're dealing with, it's mainly through the Northern Hemisphere, so we see North America, Europe and Asia is where they're mainly doing their international business. I guess one area that we often disregard or we don't give as much consideration is the fact that New Zealand, almost 40% are dealing with New Zealand on a regular basis. And in fact, if you have a look at the number of exporters dealing with a particular location, you would find that New Zealand has the most Australian exporters dealing with that particular country, over and above any other country in and around. In terms of who they see themselves, if you're primarily a freight forwarder, does your business currently operate with a customs brokerage arm? So that's that scenario where, as a freight forwarder, you may have somebody who can undertake customs broking, bearing in mind that if you are a freight forwarder dealing with customs, you need a registered customs agent to undertake that on your behalf. So what they're saying is that almost 2/3 of business now have a customs broker on their staff, and 15% there don't. So they outsource that to an agent. Now, this last slide just highlights if there was an area of their business that they wanted to expand. So if you're a freight forwarder, how could you perhaps fix or do business better? What they're saying here is that they would like to expand into new markets. That is the growth area for them as a freight forwarder in terms of improving how they do business. And if it's an interesting answer, because if you consider if you were an importer and exporter, and I'm talking to you and I say to you, well, what do you think, how would you grow your business? It's most likely going to be a similar type of answer, and that is the expansion of new and emerging markets. So looking for new markets to do business. On the other side of things, what do you think are the greatest external factor impacting their business? And that's things outside their business, such as economic conditions and also consumer demand. Now, if you think about it, these are external, uncontrollable situations that they can't handle. Also, we've got other external issues around currency exchange rates, competition. So that just gives you a sense of what the freight forwarding industry looks like in Australia and how they position themselves globally. Any questions about the freight forwarding industry in Australia? Okay. So, in an effort to get a sense of, once again, the services and the interactions that the freight forwarding industry has, we can have a look at this particular scenario here. We've got the shipment here, and we've got country A, which is, let's say, Australia, country B, let's say Vietnam. So, in many ways, you've got two specific sets of activities that the freight forwarder might find themselves in. One of them is operational aspects around the physical movement, and the other side is dealing with that regulatory operations. And that regulatory operations, which we highlighted down here, customs declaration, and a range of other things, is that area of documentation. So you could almost say they do the physical and also they do the documentation. So over here on the physical operations, they do the packing. We've got the packing here. They do the collection from the consignor. I think we'll put that in the handling. Yep. They do the consolidation. They do the transport, loading at port, and they do the transshipment. Now, transshipment, I'm not sure we had that on our list, but let's just put that up there as a separate area or function or service that's offered by a freight forwarder. So we're building up a strong sense, transport, transshipment, of what they do. Now, in support of that, in terms of documentation, export documentation, transport documentation, import manifest, financial arrangements, pretty well matching those type of things. So each and every one of those activities requires some form of documentation along the way. On the other side of the, so on the import side, the unloading, the release, the delivery to the consignee, the unpacking at consignee, disposing of packaging, return container, are pretty well encapsulated with them. So I don't think there's any new areas that we can add to there. And regulatory operations, the documentation that goes with each of those activities. So it's one of physical and one of documentation. Now, what that means for a freight forwarder, a customs broker, or one in the same, they require a significant amount of information to undertake that role. So if you found yourself in a freight forwarding business, you wouldn't have the expectation that you would know all of this, but somebody within that business is going to have a knowledge of a range of different things. And this is from Branch, which is the, he just lists in there what the expectation of a freight forwarder might be. So it's an understanding of international trading. You've got to be conversant with Incoterms, and that's updated regularly, recently updated for 2020. You've got to have an understanding of documentary credits and finance options. I'd say less so, because when we talk about those documentary credits, financial options, while it is part of the sales transaction, typically that's between the importer and his bank and also the buyer. So you probably wouldn't necessarily need that. You'd have to have a strong understanding of international carriers. You'd also want to understand how wharves and airports, delivery and receiving process, how that actually works. Strong understanding of customs and what the rules and regulations are around that, particularly if you're moving goods that might be perishable. So you need to have an understanding of quarantine processes. Obviously, clearances and compliance, that's more the remit of your customs broker. And also, there might be an expectation that the importer or exporter is going to ask you something about tariffs. Is there any relief for tariffs? And laws relating to prohibited and restricted goods. And that requires an understanding of government regulation. These two in many ways go together. You should have an understanding of rules of origin, preferential tariff treatment. Rules of origin are mainly associated with determination of tariffs. Because we know that a lot of goods move around the globe until they finally get to a point of assembly in one particular country. There are certain arrangements around where that tariff, so you might have a tariff arrangement with Japan, or you might have a tariff arrangement with Vietnam, China. So you need to understand that might go from China to Vietnam to Japan and back to Australia. Rules of origin help you understand that the tariff requirements. And because some of those countries are going to have preferential tariff treatment. So you're going to have a free trade agreement, which might mean that there's no tariffs from that particular country. There might be duty concessions, there might be a drawback or trade-ex scheme. So if you're an exporter, you might, part of that global value chain, you get your, part of your final product is manufactured in China. So when the goods come in from China, you pay a tariff on that. And then you export it again. Well, the trade-ex scheme allows you to reclaim that tariff that you paid when you paid for that good to come in from China. Policy bylaws, dumping and things like that. So that's quite high level knowledge. I would expect that would be probably reside more in the management side of things, or somebody or a consultant who's brought in to have that level of knowledge. Dangerous goods and special cargo, that would be an area of expertise of a freight forwarder. Not all freight forwarders would get themselves involved in dangerous goods and special cargo. Electronic data interchange, government computer systems. So if you want to deal with goods moving out of the country, you're going to have to be au fait with the ICS, the government's computer system, because you're going to have to submit documentation through that process. Freight rates is really important in your role as a freight forwarder. Cargo liability insurance claims practice, probably less so. As I said, the expectation isn't on the exporter, on the freight forwarder necessarily to have full knowledge of insurance. It's just good practice to inform the shipper that insurance is something that they might want to consider, because most importers or the person whose goods you're moving think that you, as the freight forwarder, is going to cover any losses along the way, which is not the case based on an agent-principal type relationship. And generally, unless you take insurance, the carrier has got quite limited liability. So that's the importance of that. Packing, marketing, stowing cargo, we'll talk about at some point in time. And there are other types of considerations along the way. So when you have a look at those type of knowledge, there's a lot of knowledge required for a freight forwarder to perform those roles if you're going to do that job well. So hopefully through the course of the semester we're going to get in a little bit deeper into some of those areas. Some of those areas you're already quite familiar with, but we're trying to build out on that level of knowledge. So in terms of the functions of the export agent, we could isolate them into just a few areas. And as an export agent, you could say that one of the tasks involved by a freight forwarder may be to undertake a transport distribution analysis. Now, that's going to come up here. Now, typically, if you're performing a transport distribution analysis on behalf of your client, you're going to have a pretty close relationship with that client. It might be a situation where you're just beginning your relationship with that client. It's a first-time exporter, and they're really quite unfamiliar with the options available to them in terms of moving their goods to a particular country. You know, they're not sure whether it's air, they're not sure whether it's sea, if it's coming from Australia. If they're in Europe, they're not sure whether it's sea, air, rail, road. So this is where a transport distribution analysis can be really quite helpful to consider that range of options that are available to the exporter. So you would undertake that and you would provide that as a service to the importer or exporter to give them a sense of perhaps the choices that they might want to take up. Something that works in light of that is the transport arrangement. So not only do they do the investigation, so this is an investigative type process, and what it might mean is that you come up with a couple of scenarios where you say, okay, if you send it this way, this is what your cost is. If you send it by air, this is if you send it by sea, this is if you send it by perhaps rail. And the bottom line is going to be how long it takes by air and sea, how long it takes by the other forms of transportation, and how much it costs. And then it comes back to the nature of the product and the requirements of the customer. So once that transportation distribution analysis is done, and it's not a requirement, it just may be something that you're asked for, that major function of booking the transport is that role of the freight forwarder. So it's ensuring that you're getting the best possible deal for your importer or exporter. So it's that function of booking of transport. Now, historically, if you ask somebody to say, what does a freight forwarder do? A lot of people would say that, oh, well, they make transportation arrangements. That's their job. But it's evolved, as we've seen through changes in globalisation. And they're often referred to as the architect of transport. As we saw here, at every step in the way there's a level of documentation required, so they need to prepare and the prescribed documentation for each step of the process. So that's another task that they undertake. Also customs, so all the customs clearance arrangements, that's a specific task that needs to be undertaken. Now it looks like I've just cut off a word there. That could be customs interaction. I'll clarify that. Okay, so that's one part. The other part is that another function is the payment of freight and other charges. So because they're coordinating, this is that traditional role, they undertake the payment of freight to the service providers. That's a task on their behalf. Another function of the export agent is packing and warehousing. So the packing of goods for transit and warehousing provision. So we've spoken about storage here, we've spoken about packaging there. That's another primary function of a freight forwarder. Cargo insurance, we've touched on before, process of insuring the goods for insurance. Not necessarily a formal function of the freight forwarder, but certainly something to be aware of. And finally, that area that probably sets them apart from other service providers is this idea of consolidation, groupage and special services. And that's all designed to provide a more economical option for those shipments which are less than container load. So that's the export agent side. So that's the side of moving the goods out of the country. They may also be called upon to take the goods as they come into the country. So that's the process of informing the importer of the date and location. So that's keeping the importer informed of the arrival arrangements for their goods coming from overseas. Customs clearance, that presentation and clearance of the cargo. Now, typically, as the goods come into Australia or any other country, there's going to be some value-added tax, there might be some duties, there might be some freight payments. That's usually something that the freight forwarder will look after. And then they will, once the customs clearance is undertaken, they will move the goods to the importer. Mindful that if it is a full container load that consists of a range of different LCLs, then what they call break bulk, so they'll separate them out and make sure that they go to the appropriate persons. Anybody have any questions about those main functions? Pretty